Fast forward. Years ago, when I was 21, I worked the night shift at a small 24-hour convenience store at the outskirts of town. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and I actually enjoyed the quiet hours of the job. Just me, the hums of refrigerators, and occasional late-night customers. At the time, the store had a strict policy: no loitering after 2 a.m. due to an uptick in petty theft and vandalism in the area. Every night it was just me and my coworker, an older guy named Mike who mostly kept to himself. On rare occasion, the manager would drop by to check on things, but most of the time we were on our own. The job was fine until one particular night, and this was towards the end of my contract. I have always struggled figuring out my instinct, but that night before leaving my house for work, I had this feeling that something wasn't right. I started my shift at 10 p.m. The night was slow, and quite just a handful of customers moving in and out. By 1 a.m., the place was dead quiet. That's when the phone rang. A woman's voice, sharp and impatient. She asked if we carried a specific brand of cigarettes. I told her we didn't have. She let out a frustrated sigh of anger, muttering something under her breath before abruptly hanging up the phone. Strange, right? But nothing too unusual. About 15 minutes later, an old sedan pulled into the parking lot. 3 people came out of it. 2 men and a woman, all in their late 40s or early 50s. As soon as the woman stepped inside, I recognized her from the called. She didn't acknowledge me at first, just browsing the aisle with her 2 companions. Something about them felt off. They weren't talking, not really looking at the items, just lingering and watching. Then, as if flipping over a switch, the woman suddenly then became over-friendly. She walked down the counter and then asked if I knew any good auto shop in the area. That's when I noticed the clipboard in her hand, a thick stack of papers, and a black pen resting on top. I gave her a half-hearted answer, pointing her towards a shop a few blocks down, but my gut told me she wasn't really interested in car repair store. The whole interaction felt so uncomfortable. While the conversation was going on, her 2 companions had positioned themselves strategically. One near the door, the other by the refrigerated drinks in the back. It wasn't until when I turned to check the security monitor that I realized what was happening. The guy by the drinks wasn't looking at the beverages. He was watching Mike, who was at the back room handling inventory, while the other guy by the door, he had gently flipped the door lock. My heart spiked. I had no idea what their plan was, but I didn't want to find out. Casually, I reached under the counter and pressed the silent alarm. The woman must have sensed my shift in demeanor, because she suddenly placed her clipboard on the counter and smiled. "Actually," she said, "we might need some direction." I force a smile, play along while my eyes flicker on the security cameras. I could see the flashing light indicating that the alarm has been received. Mike stepped out from the back, and immediately, the energy in the room changed. The man near the drinks tense. The one by the door shifted uneasily. Then, as if nothing has happened, the woman grabbed her clipboard and nodded. "Thanks for your help." They left. Quickly after they left, I stood frozen behind the counter, my pulse still racing. Mike gave me a long look before stepping up beside me with his arms crossed. "You pressed the alarm?" "Didn't you?" he asked. I nodded. He let out a whistle. "Good called." The police arrive about 10 minutes later, light splashing but siren off. 2 officers stepped inside, their expression calm but very serious. I recounted everything, the phone called, the way they positioned themselves, the clipboard, the locker door. The young officer, a guy who looked barely older than me, took notes while the other, a woman with graying hair and a sharp gaze, listened carefully. "They didn't try to take anything?" she asked. "No," I said. "But I felt like they were waiting for something, or testing something." The officers exchange a look. "Your store has been flagged a few times for suspicious activities," the woman finally said. "Nothing major, but there's been report of business cases like this, mostly within late hours like this. Minimal staff, which make it an easy target." A chill ran through me. Mike scoffed, shaking his head. The officer checked the security footage, but as expected, the trio hadn't done anything outright illegal. The act was just enough reason to set up alarm bells in my head. Before they left, the younger officer handed me a card. "Call us if you see anything." I took it with shaky hands. For the rest of my shift, every sound, every car pulling into the lot, every creak in the building got me at the edge. Even Mike, who is usually indifferent about everything, kept glancing at the windows. By the time the morning shift arrived, I was more than ready to leave. As I stepped outside, I glanced around the parking lot. There was no sign of the sedan or the trio. Even as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking that the situation wasn't over yet, and I was right. 2 nights later, my shift started as normal. My mind could not rest. I kept thinking of what has happened the 2 nights before. I told myself maybe I was just overreacting, that maybe they were just weird customer and nothing more, but I couldn't ignore the feeling of unease in my stomach. Mike had taken the night off, which means I was left alone. Just me, the flickering overhead light, and the occasional hum of the fridge compressor kicking on. By 1 a.m., the store was empty. I had just started restocking the cigarette shelf behind the counter when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires crunching over gravel in the parking lot. I turned to look at the security cameras. My blood ran cold. I didn't even have time to process the whole situation. The old sedan again? Out of a sudden, the door opened of the store. The woman from the night before walked in first with the same clipboard in her hand. The 2 men follow, positioning themselves just like last time. One near the back cooler and the other at the entrance. The door didn't chime. I realized that the electronic sound produced by the door during closing has been cut off. "Good evening," the woman greeted, her voice overly friendly. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to be polite. "Can I help you?" She smiled, stepping forward. "Actually, you can." She placed the clipboard on the counter and slid it towards me. "We are doing a survey on local businesses. Just a few questions." My hands stayed glued to the counter. The air felt different this time. Heavier. I glanced at the security camera. The man near the entrance was standing too close to the door handle, blocking it, while the other was still at the coolers. But he wasn't looking at the drinks, but he was watching me through the reflection of the glass. The woman tapped the clipboard. "It won't take long," said the woman in a calm voice. I forced myself to be calm. Then I spotted something that sent a chill down my spine. The security camera wasn't blinking. It has been on earlier. I was sure of it. Somehow they had cut the feed. I needed to get out immediately, keeping my expression neutral. I reached under the counter, pretending to grab a pen. Instead, I wrapped my fingers around the emergency panic button and pressed. Nothing happened. The siren alarm wasn't working. I felt my stomach drop. The woman's smile filtered slightly, like she could tell I had figured it out. That's when she said something that made my blood turn into ice. "No one is coming to help you this time." She said it casually, like it was a fact, still holding the clipboard. My breath caught in my throat. The man at the door shifted slightly, his hands hovering at the door of the lock. The other one had moved closer, no longer pretending to browse. I knew if I froze, it wouldn't end well. I forced a nervous laugh, acting as if I didn't notice anything. "Sorry," I said, tapping the counter. "My manager handles everything. I can't sign anything." The woman tilted her head, studying me. "Maybe just a few questions will do," said the woman. My mind was racing. My phone was in the back room. The landline was under the counter, but I will have to turn my back to grab it, and I couldn't risk it. Then I remembered something. Earlier that night, I had opened the back door slightly that night to let in fresh air. The store had an automatic locking system. If the door shut completely, it will require a key to reopen it from the other side. I had no chance. I let out an exaggerated sigh. "You know what? My manager might still be here in the back." I mentioned, "Let me check." The woman's expression didn't change, but I could tell she didn't like the answer. She opened her mouth to speak to stop me, but I didn't wait. I turned and walked quickly towards the back, forcing myself to run. Every nerve in my body was screaming. As soon as I walked past the stockroom, I bolted the door. I shoved through the back exit just as I heard hurried footsteps behind me. The next second I was outside. I threw my full weight against the door, slamming it shut. I heard the door lock click as if something heavy had hit the other side. I took off running. my lungs burning and my heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't stop. I kept running. There was a gas station a few blocks ahead of me. As I kept running, I didn't stop until I was inside the gas station, collapsing against the counter, gasping for breath. The cashier and some guy in his 50s stare at me as if I was insane. "Are you okay?" I shook my head, frantically pointing towards the store. "Call the cops." When the police arrived, the sedan was gone. They searched the store, checked the cameras. The footage has been wiped clean. The security system had been tampered with. Whoever they were, they had planned this. The police took my statement and waited till the morning. When the manager arrived, I quitted the job. For weeks, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified I will see that old sedan again, but I never did. To this day, I don't know what they wanted. I'm just grateful that I wasn't hurt physically, but the trauma lived with me forever. When I was a kid, I never really thought much about the stories my dad used to tell and how protective he was when it comes to our whereabouts. He'd always mention how growing up, his childhood home was surrounded by strange occurrences, footsteps when no one was there, lights flickering and the feeling of being watched. But I never understood why he was so protective of us, why he would always check the locks twice or walk us to the car whenever we were going out. It wasn't until I was older that I learned the real reason why. My dad's childhood best friend had disappeared when they were young, vanished without a trace. It turned out years later that his friend had been another victim of the same man who later became infamous as the Golden State Killer. That's when I started to understand the fear that shaped my dad's every move. He believed that whoever took his friend was still out there watching. One summer night, when I was around 6 years old, my parents had gone out for a dinner party, and my older sister was at a friend's house. I was left alone at home, sitting on the couch with my dog Daisy, who was a golden retriever. It was one of those nights where everything felt too quiet, the kind of stillness that you can't ignore. I was in the living room watching cartoons when I noticed something strange. There was a large window in the living room that looked out onto the street. It was dark outside, and the only light came from the street lamp. I glanced at the window and saw a shadow move across it. It wasn't the usual shadows from trees or cars passing by. This was different. The shadow didn't move like something natural. It was slow, deliberate, like someone was standing just outside watching me. I froze. My heart started to pound, and Daisy usually is calm, but this time she started to whimper beside me. Her ears perked. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light maybe. But then I saw it again. A figure standing right outside, barely visible in the reflection on the glass. A tall man just standing there staring in the window. I slowly got up and tiptoed over to the window, trying not to make a sound. The moment I peeked outside, I couldn't see anymore, but my stomach twisted with a bad feeling I couldn't shake. I closed the blinds and sat down, trying to convince myself I was paranoid, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, listening to every creak of the house. Daisy was still alert, her body tense as she stared at the door. That's when I heard it, a soft scraping noise coming from the back porch, the sound of something or someone moving against the glass. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. Then I heard a faint whisper, just loud enough to make my blood run cold. "Let me in." It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. It was a deep and gravelly, like somebody trying to keep their voice low so no one would hear. My mind raced. Should I call my parents? No, I couldn't. The phone was upstairs and I was too scared to move. The scraping continued slowly, as if the person trying to find a way inside. Then I heard the back door handle jingle. It was the worst sound I've ever heard in my life. I immediately jumped up and ran to the hallway, shouting for Daisy to follow me. I slammed the door of my room and locked it, pressing my back against the door as I held my breath. I stayed like that for a while, barely making a sound. The scraping stopped, but I could still hear someone breathing on the other side of the door. I thought I was going to pass out from fear. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps walking away, slowly and carefully, as if the person was making sure I can't hear. I waited until I was absolutely certain the coast was clear before running to grab my phone. I called my parents and told them everything. They came home immediately and called the police. The officer who arrived told us they'd checked the area, but there was no sign of anyone. The strangest part was, the next morning, I went outside to check the porch. There were muddy footprints leading to the door, but nothing more. It was like the person had vanished into thin air. Over the years, I learned that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. My dad had mentioned that, before we moved into this house, there had been a series of break-ins in the area. Nothing was ever stolen, just signs of someone trying to get in. It made me wonder if the man was still out there watching and wanting to catch another person. I haven't lived in that house for years, but every now and then when I pass by it, I can't help but feel like someone is still watching me from behind the window. The memory of the whisper still haunts me. Sometimes, I wonder if the man ever really left, or it is my dad who was always afraid. Some things are just meant to stay hidden in the shadows. As I got older, the unsettling experience didn't stop. They just became quieter. At least that's what I thought. I moved to a new city for college and lived in a small apartment downtown, away from the childhood home. But every time I came back to visit my parents, something about the house always felt strange and scary, like it was holding on to something that it didn't want to let go. A few years after I graduated, one evening I went to my old neighborhood to grab dinner with a couple of friends. As we passed by my old house, I noticed that it looked different, darker somehow, even though it was only 6 p.m. The lights inside seemed dimmer, and the window by the porch, the very one I'd stared through all those years ago, was now covered with heavy blinds. Without really thinking, I pulled over and told my friends to wait in the car. I was drawn to the house like a magnet, my feet moving on their own toward the front door. I stood there for a moment staring at the house. The porch was still there, though the furniture was gone and the yard had become overgrown with weeds. But what struck me the most was the silence. There was no sound coming from inside, no life. Suddenly, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up like I was with some imaginary scary figure. I turned and saw a figure standing at the edge of the driveway, just barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat as I froze. Unsure whether I was seeing things right, the figure didn't move, just stood there watching me with a posture that seemed unnaturally still, almost like it had been waiting for me to show up. I didn't breath. My legs felt like they were made of heavy iron metal, but somehow I managed to force myself to walk back to the car. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. The figure remained there unmoving, as if it knew I was watching. My friends were confused by my sudden rush to leave, but they didn't press it. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The mirror was gone. I haven't been back to that house since. It's funny how the mind works, how it can convince you that something is just your imagination, just a bad feeling that will fade with time. But that evening as I drove away, I knew deep down that something was still in that house. I knew that whatever it wasn't just watching from the shadows. It was waiting. Waiting for me to come back, just like it had waited years ago. And for me, that was the last time I stood in front of that window. And maybe that's why, every now and then when I lie awake at night, I can't help but wonder, how many people like me have lived in that house? How many people have left feeling like they were being followed but never understood why? And will I ever be free of the shadow? A few years ago, I needed to find an internship to progress in my education. After putting in too much effort, I couldn't secure a place at that time, and I needed to get a job to ensure that I provide for my family. Through my wife's family, I learned that a friend of theirs owned a transport company, a sort of taxi service for transportation. He needed someone to cover the night shift since the bus had to be on call for at least 24 hours a day. Being a natural night owl, I immediately expressed interest in the job. Fortunately, I was hired. After obtaining the necessary license, the work was fairly straightforward. Pick up passengers, drop them off at their destinations, and occasionally use a machine to help lift the elderly up or down the stairs. During downtime, when there were no scheduled trips, I would drive to a designated waiting area and pass the time there. I quickly found that there was a truck stop in the area where I could park and catch some sleep while waiting for trips. Nearby, there was a gas station where I would grab coffee in the early hours of my shift. On the opposite side of the truck stop, across the gas station's parking lot, stood a rundown restaurant with a motel attached to it. To avoid disturbing the sleeping truckers if I got a call in the middle of the night, I usually parked near the restaurant. After parking there night after night, I began to notice something strange. One particular motel room had a constant flow of people coming and going. At first, I thought it was nothing of it, but one night, towards the end of winter, while I was half asleep with my window slightly open, I suddenly heard yelling from the motel. A man came tumbling out of the room, sprinting away in a panic. Just seconds later, a much larger man stormed out after him, gripping something in his hand. In the dim light, I couldn't make out what it was. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should get involved, but ultimately decided it wasn't my business. So I went back to my half-sleeping state, waiting for my next call. Not much time passed before my phone went off. I had a trip scheduled an hour away. I started the bus and was pulling out of the parking lot when I spotted the big guy from earlier rounding the corner. The rest of the night was a blur of back-to-back trips, and I didn't get a chance to return home until around 3 a.m. When I finally arrived at the parking lot, I noticed that the area where I usually parked was littered with fist-sized rocks. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I just parked a few spots over and settled in to wait for my next call. Exhausted, I fell asleep almost immediately, but I was suddenly jolted awake by the blaring sound of a car horn. A vehicle was parked right in front of my bus, flashing its high beams and revving its engine aggressively. At first, I thought it was some random person who had noticed me sleeping, and thought it would be funny to mess with. Annoyed, I jumped out of the bus, ready to tell them off. But instead of driving away or stopping, the driver started inching forward and braking repeatedly, almost as if they were warning me to leave. That's when everything clicked. Not wanting to stick around and find out what was going on, I made the smart choice. I got back in the bus, locked the doors, and prepared to leave. Not wanting to seem like a pushover, I stood my ground and stared at the car. Not that I could actually see anything with its high beams nearly blinding me. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds, the car finally drove off. From that night on, I decided to park near the trucks for safety. A month passed and nothing else happened. I figured that as long as I kept parking by the trucks, I wouldn't have any more issues. Then, one Sunday night, I had a grueling 12-hour shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I hadn't had time to eat dinner before work, and the first half of my shift was packed with back-to-back trips, leaving me no time to grab a bite. When I finally got a return trip back to my home zone, I quickly parked at the far end of the nearly empty truck stop, eager to eat the late dinner my wife had packed for me. Wanting to relax, I decided to watch some TV on my phone while I ate. I shifted into a comfortable position, leaning my back against the driver's side door. As I settled in, I accidentally hit the door lock with my elbow, which, in hindsight, turned out to be a stroke of luck. As I sat there scrolling through my phone, I suddenly heard the clack of the door handle behind me. Instantly alert, I snapped back into position and quickly turned to look. That's when I saw him. A man who had pulled his head was crouching beside the bus. Before I could fully process what was happening, he dropped to the ground and began crawling underneath the vehicle. In his right hand, he clutched a massive kitchen knife. Panic shot through me. I shot up from my seat, double-checking that the other two doors were locked. My heart pounded as I scanned the area, trying to spot him. But he was still under the bus and wasn't about to step outside, not with that knife making his intentions painfully clear. Thinking fast, I turned on the engine and switched on the rear floodlights, hoping to startle him. Thankfully, it worked. I watched as he bolted from beneath the bus, sprinting toward the wooded, bushy area at the far end of the truck stop. I didn't wait around to see where he went. That was the last time I ever parked there. From that night on, I made sure every door was locked every single time I was parked.